On a stormy night in downtown Seattle, Thomas Wright, an intensely private tech CEO known for building machines smarter than people, makes a split-second decision that will rewrite his life. He's used to calculating risks, managing empires, and keeping emotions locked behind passwords. But when he hears faint cries echoing from a flooded storm drain, instinct, not logic, takes over. Two twin boys, drenched, shivering, and scared. And then, one of them softly says his name. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas." He freezes. They shouldn't know who he is. Then the other boy hands him a soaked letter addressed from a woman Thomas tried for years to forget. Sarah. His first love, and, apparently, the mother of his sons. What happens next will challenge everything Thomas thought he knew about family, love, and what it means to truly belong. Will he walk away, or will he finally become the man they need? Stay with us to find out, and if stories about hope, heart, and unexpected family touch you too, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful tales that stay with you long after the credits roll. Thomas Wright didn't believe in fate. Algorithms? Absolutely. Probability curves? Essential. But destiny? That was for fairy tales, and Thomas had stopped believing in those a long time ago. It was nearly midnight when his Tesla eased through the pouring Seattle rain. He had just finished a late strategy meeting with the board, another merger, another 100 million. The city lights blurred through his windshield, distorted by heavy raindrops and the rising mist. The kind of night where people stayed in. But Thomas didn't. He rarely did. The man was a titan in tech, the kind of CEO whose name held more weight on Wall Street than most senators. His company's AI systems were revolutionizing transportation, but his personal life? A blank slate. No wife, no kids, just a luxury condo that overlooked the bay and walls filled with patents, not people. He was cutting through a quieter neighborhood, a detour prompted by a road closure, when the car's autopilot alerted him. A blocked storm drain. Water was rising fast, gushing onto the street in a violent stream. He was about to override and reroute when he heard it. A cry. Faint, muffled, almost inhuman, but definitely a cry. He frowned, rolled down the window a crack. Nothing but the pounding rain. Then, there it was again. He swerved the car to the curb and stepped out, rain immediately soaking his cashmere coat. He didn't think, didn't pause, just followed the sound. And then he saw them. Two boys, no older than 7 or 8, clinging to the metal bars of the storm drain like their lives depended on it. One was already halfway inside, soaked to the bone, shivering violently. The other was gripping his arm, desperate to keep him from being pulled into the drain's undertow. "Help!" the boy cried again, voice hoarse and cracking. "Please, my brother's stuck!" Thomas dropped to his knees. "I've got you," he said, trying to steady his voice. "Don't let go." In a blur of motion and adrenaline, Thomas managed to brace his foot against the curb and lean into the drain. He grabbed the smaller boy's arm, slick and trembling, and pulled with every ounce of strength he had. The child slipped, but Thomas tightened his grip and gritted his teeth. One final heave, and both boys tumbled out, coughing and gasping on the wet asphalt. For a moment, no one spoke, just the sound of rain hitting pavement and 3 hearts pounding wildly. The older boy crawled toward his twin and wrapped his arms around him tightly. "Ethan," he sobbed, "you're okay, you're okay." Thomas knelt beside them, his breath shaky. "Are you hurt?" The smaller one, Ethan, shook his head slowly, tears mingling with the rain on his cheeks. His lips were blue, his hands like ice. Thomas quickly scooped him into his arms. "We need to get you both warm." He ushered them into the back seat of his Tesla, cranked the heat, and wrapped a dry blanket from his emergency kit around their tiny frames. The older boy, Daniel, he would later learn, watched Thomas with cautious, wide eyes. "Who are you?" Thomas asked softly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The older boy hesitated, then said, "I'm Daniel. He's Ethan." "No last name?" Daniel looked down. That's when Ethan, the quieter one, stirred slightly and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Thomas." The name hit Thomas like a punch to the chest. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice nearly cracking. Ethan's fingers fumbled inside his soaked coat and pulled out a piece of crumpled paper. Carefully, he handed it to Thomas. It was a letter, smudged by water, barely legible, but one name stood out at the top. "Dear Thomas." Thomas's hands trembled. He read the signature at the bottom and nearly dropped it. Sarah. A name he hadn't spoken in over 8 years. A name he'd buried with the part of him that used to believe in love. And then the last line of the letter hit him like thunder. "If you're reading this, it means you've met your sons." He stared at his boys in the mirror. Wide-eyed, identical twins with the same hazel-green flecks Sarah used to have, and everything inside him shifted. The storm outside suddenly paled in comparison to the one gathering in his chest. Thomas sat motionless in the driver's seat, the letter trembling in his hands. The rain pelted the windshield in a relentless rhythm, but the storm now lived inside him, sharp and deafening. In the back seat, the boys huddled beneath the blanket, cheeks flushed from the heater's warmth, eyes flickering between confusion and exhaustion. He reread the closing line. "If you're reading this, it means you've met your sons." The words scraped against his every breath. Sarah. 8 years. 8 years since that name had been whispered, screamed, or wept in his presence. And now, here it was, written in the soft curl of her handwriting, the same looped S she used to sign her sketchbooks. Thomas glanced up at the boys. Daniel stared back at him with those same intense eyes that had once looked at him across a dinner table lit by candlelight and filled with laughter. Ethan leaned against his brother, slowly slipping into sleep, his small hand still gripping the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. "I need to know," Thomas whispered to himself. Then louder, to Daniel, "Where's your mom?" Daniel blinked. "She's in the hospital. She's sick." Thomas's chest tightened. "Which hospital?" Daniel hesitated. "I think it's called Mercy West. We were with Miss Ruth, but she had to work tonight. We went outside to sell drawings." "Drawings?" Daniel nodded slowly. "To help pay for Mom's medicine. We weren't supposed to go far, but Ethan dropped the sketchbook and it slid near the drain. He tried to grab it." Thomas rubbed a hand down his face. "And you nearly lost him because of it." Daniel looked away, ashamed. "I tried to hold on." "You did more than that," Thomas said gently. "You saved your brother." The boy's eyes lifted at that, just slightly, enough for a flicker of recognition to cross his young face. The approval of a man who had unknowingly walked away from them before they were even born. Thomas set the car into drive. "We're going to the hospital," he said. "But Miss Ruth said—" "I'll talk to Miss Ruth," Thomas interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "Right now, your mom needs to see you, and I need to see her." As the Tesla glided through the wet streets, Thomas gripped the steering wheel with knuckles gone pale. Every memory of Sarah was clawing its way out from behind the walls he'd spent years building. The way she laughed with her whole face. The night she stood in his apartment doorway, holding a sonogram photo, tears streaking down her cheeks. "I know what the doctor said, but this is real, Thomas. I feel it." And he had crushed it, all of it, with logic, with spreadsheets, with fear. His voice had been cold. "I was told at 19 that I can't have children. You know that." Sarah had begged him to believe in something outside the numbers. "What if they're wrong?" He hadn't answered. He'd walked out. And now, here he was, driving through a storm with the very proof he'd denied, sleeping quietly in the back seat. At Mercy West, the ER receptionist looked up with practiced indifference. Thomas didn't waste time. "Sarah Brenner? What room?" The woman tapped keys, then eyed him. "Relation." He paused, his throat tightening. "Family," he said quietly. Room 417 was tucked at the end of a quiet wing. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows. Thomas walked slowly, the boys holding hands beside him. He stopped at the door. For a moment his hand refused to move. Then Daniel knocked gently. "Mom?" A faint voice answered, raspy but warm. "Danny?" Thomas pushed the door open. Sarah lay propped against a pillow, thinner than he remembered, her once rich auburn hair dulled and wispy, but her eyes were still the same, bright, soulful, fierce. She froze when she saw him. The silence stretched, heavy with years of unsaid words. "Thomas," she breathed, barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, unsure if he should. "I found them. In the rain." A slow, painful smile formed on her lips. "Then I was right." Daniel and Ethan climbed onto the bed without hesitation, each finding a place against her sides like two puzzle pieces that had been missing all day. Thomas stood at the foot, his heart pounding. Why didn't you try again?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I did. I wrote. I called. Your assistant always said you were unavailable. The letters came back unopened. Eventually I gave up." He closed his eyes, anguish swelling in his chest. "I never saw them. I never knew." "I figured that out," she said softly. "That's why I wrote the letter." Thomas swallowed hard. "They said you're sick." Sarah nodded. "Congenital heart failure. It's progressed. There's not much time." Thomas looked at the boys, his sons, and back to Sarah. "Then I'm not wasting another second," he said quietly. And, for the first time in nearly a decade, Sarah reached out, fingers thin, trembling, and he took her hand without hesitation. Outside, the storm began to quiet. Inside, the first piece of a long broken heart began to heal. Thomas didn't know how long he stood there after Sarah fell asleep. The boys had curled up against her sides, drifting into the kind of sleep only children could manage, peaceful, deep, and oddly forgiving. The pale beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, a metronome counting the moments he wished he could take back. He sank into the armchair beside the hospital bed, finally allowing himself to exhale. Outside the window, the storm had passed. The glass reflected the dim hospital light and the ghost of the man he used to be. "She told us stories about you," Daniel said softly. Thomas turned, surprised to find the boy awake, staring at him in the dark. "Not often, but enough." "What kind of stories?" Thomas asked, his voice raw with a vulnerability he rarely let slip. Daniel shrugged, pulling the blanket higher. "That you liked robots and used to build computers from junk. That you didn't like birthdays but loved black coffee. That you once sketched a spaceship on a napkin and said it could save people." Thomas smiled faintly, the memory catching him off guard. "I did that. Your mom said I was ridiculous, but she kept that napkin anyway." "She said you were the smartest man she ever met," Daniel added, his eyes wide with something like admiration, but guarded. "But also the most afraid." The words landed like a punch to the ribs. Thomas nodded slowly. She wasn't wrong. A silence fell between them, not awkward, but tender, necessary. Then Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She said if we ever found you, to give you this." Thomas took the note with trembling fingers. The paper was soft with wear, the ink slightly smudged. It wasn't long. Sarah never wasted words. "Thomas, if they find you, it means the universe still believes in second chances. Please don't waste it. They're yours, if you want them. But more than that, they're beautiful. Be someone who sees that. Tears burned the edges of his vision, and he didn't hide them. He folded the letter carefully, placing it over his heart. "You must have a lot of questions," he said to Daniel. The boy nodded. "But I'm tired." Thomas chuckled softly. "That's fair. Will you still be here in the morning?" Daniel asked, almost too quietly. "Yes," Thomas said firmly. "I'll be right here." By sunrise, the room was bathed in soft golden light. Sarah stirred, and Thomas was already standing, offering her a glass of water before she could ask. She smiled weakly. "You still remember?" "I remember more than I wish I'd forgotten," he said gently. Sarah took a sip, her hand brushing his. "They like you. I don't deserve that." "No," she agreed, "but they don't know that version of you, and you have a choice now." Thomas sat on the edge of the chair again. "Why didn't you tell me? Really?" Her eyes shimmered, but she held his gaze. "Because when I told you the truth back then, you didn't believe me. You looked at me like I was trying to trap you." "I was wrong," he admitted hoarsely. "I was terrified. Of love, of failing, of being what my father was." Sarah's expression softened. "You're not your father, and you don't have to be perfect. They don't need perfect. They just need you." He looked at the boys sleeping soundly beside her. "I don't even know how to be around kids." Sarah laughed, the sound fragile but real. "Then learn. From them. They're the best teachers I know." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then that's what I'll do." Later that morning, Miss Ruth arrived at the hospital, her expression sharp with worry until she saw the boys safe and sleeping. Her stern eyes turned to Thomas. "You're Thomas," she said, voice edged with steel. "I am. You're the man Sarah cried over when she thought I wasn't listening." Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm also the man who's staying this time." Miss Ruth studied him, arms crossed. "She doesn't need more heartbreak. Neither do those boys. They won't get it from me. You can't undo the years." "I know," Thomas replied earnestly, "but I can show up for the ones ahead." Ruth gave a slow nod. "Then prove it, day by day." That night, after Ruth left and the nurses dimmed the lights, Ethan stirred from his nap and crawled over to Thomas without a word, settling into his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. Thomas wrapped his arms around the small frame, his heart aching with a love he never thought he'd feel. As the boy's breathing slowed, he whispered into Thomas's chest, "Mom says you used to build rainbows." Thomas blinked, startled. "Rainbows?" "Yeah," Ethan murmured sleepily. "She said you made colors out of wires and dreams." Thomas swallowed hard, brushing a hand over Ethan's hair. "Maybe. I'll build a new one. For you, for your brother, for her." Outside the window, the last traces of the storm faded, replaced by a stillness Thomas hadn't felt in years. Inside that hospital room, the future began, softly, bravely, and full of possibility. The following days unfolded with a quiet rhythm Thomas had never known, a cadence measured not by stock tickers or acquisition deadlines, but by the rustle of cereal boxes in the morning, the clatter of small footsteps down hospital corridors, and the gentle, intermittent wheeze of Sarah's breath. He arrived at the hospital early each day, often before the boys woke. Sometimes he brought them muffins, sometimes sketchbooks. Always he brought something, because showing up empty-handed still felt unnatural to a man who'd built his life on offering value. But Ethan didn't want things. He wanted lap space and someone to listen to his ideas about dinosaur-shaped cars. Daniel, more reserved, tested Thomas with questions that required answers not just of fact, but of intent. "What happens when people get tired of trying?" he asked one morning, his voice barely louder than a whisper as he looked out the window. Thomas had paused, choosing his words with care. "They rest, and, if they're lucky, someone sits beside them and says, 'I'm still here. We can try again tomorrow.'" That answer seemed to settle something in Daniel. Later, he offered Thomas a lopsided drawing of 3 stick figures standing under an umbrella. "It's us," he said simply, "and the umbrella's the part where you didn't leave." Every night, Thomas returned to his penthouse, once a fortress of isolation, now feeling cavernous and sterile. The silence was louder now. He often sat in the boy's future bedroom, still an empty guest room, and stared at the swatches of paint colors and bunk bed catalogs on his tablet. But he wasn't rushing, not because he doubted, but because Sarah still held the center, and she was fading. On the 4th evening, after dinner trays had been cleared and the boys had fallen asleep in a blanket nest beside her bed, Sarah motioned for Thomas to come closer. Her cheeks had lost more color, her voice thinner now, but still edged with the same familiar fire. "Promise me something," she said, her fingers brushing his wrist. Thomas nodded, eyes locked on hers. "If something happens to me, don't let anyone else take them just to prove a point. Not for blood, not for reputation. Only love. I swear," he said hoarsely, "on everything I never knew I could love until now." She gave a faint, tired smile. "That's a start." Then, after a pause, "I want them to remember me laughing." "They will," he said. "They already do." Her eyes drifted to the sketchbook Ethan had left on her tray. "They told me you drew a rainbow with them." Thomas smiled. "It looked more like spaghetti, but they didn't mind. You used to say color was the language of hope." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing shallow. "I think they've started to teach you to speak again." Thomas sat beside her for hours, listening to the hum of machines, the occasional twitch of a sleeping child. And when Sarah stirred again, he reached for her hand. Not like someone clinging to the past, but someone promising to carry her forward in ways words never could. The next day, Thomas didn't go to work. He canceled 3 meetings, postponed a shareholder call, let his assistant panic over an unfinalized product demo. The world he'd once commanded could wait. Instead, he took Daniel and Ethan to the park across from the hospital. The boys ran toward the swings, laughter spilling out like music. Thomas stood watching, his hands tucked in his pockets. Miss Ruth approached from a nearby bench. "You look like a man trying to memorize the moment," she said. "I am," Thomas replied quietly. "They've changed since you arrived," Ruth added, watching the boys. Daniel's nightmares stopped. Ethan smiles in his sleep again. Sarah, she's resting more deeply. Thomas looked down, humbled. "I never knew showing up could be enough." Ruth glanced sideways at him. "It isn't. But when it's real, it's a beginning." He nodded. Then she said something he wasn't prepared for. "There's a cousin from Sarah's side, Judith. She's been circling. She filed for temporary guardianship this morning." Thomas's heart dropped. "She's got no real bond with the boys, barely visited. But she's got money, influence, and a lawyer." "What does she want?" Thomas asked. "A legacy," Ruth said simply. "The right name, the sympathy headlines, maybe the trust Sarah never used." Thomas clenched his jaw. "They're not pawns." "No," Ruth said, "but you'll have to fight for them like they are." Thomas looked out across the playground. Daniel helping Ethan onto the tire swing, their laughter unbothered by the world's dark intentions. He would protect that. He would protect them. Even if it meant taking on the system that once told him he was nothing. Even if it meant confronting the ghost of a name he'd long buried. Even if it meant becoming something no spreadsheet could measure. A father. The days that followed moved like a slow, fragile melody, each one a delicate blend of warmth and worry. Sarah's health began to wane more rapidly than anyone wanted to admit. The color in her cheeks faded like a watercolor left in the rain. Her smiles came less frequently, her laughter softer, but always for the boys. Thomas had shifted his life around her now. He no longer checked stock reports before breakfast or returned investor emails during lunch. Instead, he packed small peanut butter sandwiches for the boys, learned the names of their favorite cartoon shows, and spent hours reading about cardiomyopathy in the hospital's quiet lounge when no one was watching. At night, he sat in the family wing's guest cot, journaling things Sarah said, moments he wanted the boys to remember even if she couldn't be there to say them again. "Your mother once told me," he imagined himself telling them years from now, "that hope is what you hold on to when logic lets go." One particularly quiet afternoon, Sarah beckoned Thomas over while the twins napped on the floor beside her bed, curled into each other like matching puzzle pieces. She reached for the small leather bag beside her. Her hands shook slightly, but her gaze was clear, focused. From the bag, she pulled a neatly folded envelope, the paper weathered and soft at the edges. "I wrote this a few weeks ago," she said gently. "Back when I knew things were changing." Thomas took the envelope but didn't open it. "I wasn't sure if I should give it to you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me thought maybe I'd get better, that I'd be the one to tell them everything myself. But now—" She trailed off, her eyes drifting to the boys. "Sarah," he said, emotion thick in his throat. "Don't do this. Don't talk like you're—" "I have to," she interrupted, gently but firmly. "You know I do." He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "They'll need you, Thomas," she whispered, "in a way I won't be able to prepare them for, and they're going to ask hard questions about me, about you, about why none of this made sense for so long." He looked down at the envelope in his hands. His name was written on the front in her unmistakable cursive, "To Thomas, for the moments after." "I'll be honest," she said, tears forming but not falling. "I hated you for a long time, not for leaving, but for not knowing you left more behind than me. And then, one day, Ethan asked where his father was, and I said the only thing I could think of. He's out there. Maybe he doesn't know about you yet, but he will, and he'll come when he's ready." Thomas reached for her hand, gripped it firmly. "I'm here. I'm staying. And I will raise them to know who you were, I swear." Sarah let out a trembling breath, her fingers tightening briefly around his. "I believe you," she said. "I do." There was a soft knock at the door. Miss Ruth peeked in. "Sorry to interrupt. Sarah, there's someone who'd like to speak with you. It's a legal matter." Sarah nodded tiredly. "Judith?" Ruth's face said enough. Thomas's jaw tightened, but Sarah shook her head gently. "Let me handle her." He stepped outside the room but lingered close, arms crossed, heart pounding. 10 minutes passed before Judith left, walking past him without a glance. Her face was smug, her heels clicking arrogantly down the corridor. When Thomas re-entered the room, Sarah looked drained. "She's serious," Sarah murmured. "She's filed for guardianship. Claims you're exploiting our story to boost your public image." "I'll fight it," Thomas said firmly. "Every lie, every insinuation." Sarah gave a small nod. "I know, but just in case. That letter, keep it close. Read it when you're alone. And if it helps in court, use it." The rest of the evening was quiet. The boys drew superheroes on the back of hospital menus. Sarah rested with her eyes closed but her hand in Thomas's, and Thomas watched over them all with the unmistakable ache of someone realizing time was thinning. That night, alone in his penthouse, he opened the letter. Inside, her handwriting danced across the page, steady and fierce. "If you are reading this, I am no longer beside you, but I am still with you in every way that matters. Daniel and Ethan are yours, not by blood alone, but by every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every whispered promise you'll now have to keep. Be the father I saw in your eyes the day you saved them, and if the world tries to take them from you, show them this. I chose you, and I believe in you still. Love them for both of us." Thomas held the letter to his chest, his breath shaking. He didn't need a courtroom to tell him what was right, but he would stand in one if he had to. Because this wasn't just about legacy, it was about love. And this time, he would not leave anyone behind. The morning Sarah passed away, the world seemed to hold its breath. A stillness hung in the air, too heavy for the sunrise, too silent for the city. The hospital room smelled of lavender and lemon balm. The oils Sarah had once said reminded her of peace. Thomas sat by her side, one hand wrapped around hers, the other resting gently on Ethan's back as the boy slept, cheek against the edge of the hospital mattress. Daniel sat in the armchair across the room, knees pulled to his chest, quietly sketching his mother's face. His strokes were gentle, reverent. When the machines fell quiet, when the final delicate breath left her body without drama or fanfare, Thomas didn't move. Not at first. The nurse gently placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "She's gone." But Thomas already knew. He felt it in his bones, in the sudden drop in temperature, in the way the light shifted, like the world was aware it had lost something sacred. Later, the boys stood beside him in the hallway, holding his hands, one on either side. No tears yet, just confusion, the kind that drapes itself around young hearts too soon exposed to grief. "Is she sleeping?" Ethan asked, barely audible. Thomas knelt down, arms wrapping around both boys. He swallowed hard before speaking. "She's gone to heaven, buddy. She's not in pain anymore." Daniel nodded, but his jaw tightened. "She said she'd be here when I turned 10. "She is," Thomas whispered, "just not the way we hoped." The funeral was small, intimate. Ruth arranged the details with quiet grace, guiding Thomas through it all as if she were holding up the weight of the world on her shoulders. Friends from the shelter, a few nurses from the hospital, and several neighbors came with flowers and whispered condolences. The boys sat front row in suits too big for their frames, eyes wide and solemn. Thomas spoke last. He stood before the crowd, hands shaking only slightly, voice low but steady. "Sarah was the bravest person I've ever known," he began. "She raised 2 boys with nothing but love, faith, and a strength I can only aspire to. She believed in people, even when we didn't deserve it, especially me." He paused, voice cracking. "I wasn't there when she needed me most, but I'm here now, for our boys, for every promise I never made, but will keep." After the service, a woman in a gray suit approached him. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement. "Mr. Wright," she said coolly, offering a stiff handshake. "I'm representing Ms. Judith Marchand. She's petitioning for custody of Daniel and Ethan." Thomas blinked. "Judith?" "The boy's great-aunt. Sarah's cousin. She believes they belong with blood relatives." Thomas took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. "And what about their father?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "There's no legal record of paternity, and your connection, while emotional, is not formally established." "She knew who I was," Thomas said firmly. "She left a letter. Then you'll need to present that in court. Along with evidence you're equipped to raise 2 children." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I built an empire from scratch. I can build a home." The lawyer gave a polite but skeptical smile and handed him the court notice. "We'll see you in 3 weeks." That night, the boys sat on the floor of Thomas's penthouse, curled into sleeping bags they'd refused to trade for the guest beds. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of blankets. Thomas sat on the edge of the couch, unsure if he should speak. Ethan broke the silence. "Uncle Thomas, if Mom's not here, does that mean you'll leave too?" The question sliced through him like glass. "No," he said, voice trembling. He crossed the room and sat on the floor beside them. "No, I'm not going anywhere, I promise." Daniel looked up, tears finally spilling. "But what if the lady from court takes us?" Thomas pulled them both into his lap, holding them tightly. "I won't let that happen," he whispered fiercely. "I will fight for you with everything I have." Ethan leaned into his chest, small fingers gripping his shirt. "Mom said you had a computer heart, but it's not cold, it's warm." Thomas laughed brokenly. "She said that, huh?" Daniel nodded. "She said, he's a computer with a pulse, just needed the right code." Thomas kissed the tops of their heads. "Then I guess you two are the code?" And, in that moment, surrounded by grief and hope, he knew. He wasn't just stepping into a new chapter, he was building one from the ashes of regret and the roots of redemption. The court would come. The questions would come. But he had his answer, and he'd never let them down again. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and nerves. Thomas stood in front of the heavy oak doors, one hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder, the other gently squeezing Daniel's smaller hand. The boys were dressed in navy blue suits again, their collars a bit crooked, their shoes freshly polished. Thomas had barely slept in the week leading up to the hearing, not because of logistics or legal worries, but because of the quiet questions the boys whispered when they thought he was asleep. "Do you think the judge will like us? What if she thinks Aunt Judith is better?" And the one that haunted him most, "Will we still get to call you Dad?" He hadn't answered that one out loud, not yet. "Mr. Wright," a bailiff, called gently. Thomas looked up. "We're ready." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he expected, almost intimate. Wooden pews, a high bench for the judge, and a scattering of attendees. Judith Marchand sat at the far end of the room, flanked by her attorney, lips pursed, her expensive gray pantsuit a sharp contrast to the warmth Sarah had embodied. Her eyes briefly met Thomas's and narrowed, not with hatred, but with assumption, as if she'd already won. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a composed expression, adjusted her glasses and called the session to order. "Today's matter concerns the custody of Daniel and Ethan Wright. Petitioners are Judith Marchand, cousin of the deceased Sarah Benton, and Thomas Wright, who claims to be the biological father." Thomas took a breath as his attorney, James Weaver, rose to speak. "Your Honor, we intend to prove not only a biological connection between Mr. Wright and the boys, but also that he has been a stable, loving presence since reuniting with them. More importantly, we will present evidence, both emotional and legal, that their mother wished for Mr. Wright to be their guardian." Judith's lawyer rose in response. "Your Honor, this man, this billionaire CEO, knew nothing of the children for nearly a decade. My client, Ms. Marchand, has known them longer. She has roots, a quiet home. She's not chasing redemption in the media spotlight." Thomas clenched his fists under the table. The courtroom blurred briefly until he felt Ethan's hand slide over his. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered, just loud enough for Thomas to hear. His heart cracked open a little more. The judge nodded. "We'll proceed with the statements. Mr. Wright, would you approach the stand?" Thomas stood slowly, straightening his back like he had in boardrooms and interviews his entire adult life. But this felt different. There were no shareholders to impress, no markets to influence, only two small boys who looked at him like he was home. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat down. "Mr. Wright," the judge said, "you've lived a very public life. Why pursue this now?" Thomas looked at the judge, then at the boys, before answering. "Because everything I've done, every deal, every success, means nothing without them. I didn't know they existed. I wasn't there because I didn't know I had sons. But now I do, and they're not a second chance. They're my first real reason." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, folded letter. "Sarah wrote this. She gave it to Ethan the night we met." He passed it to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. The courtroom went still as she read. In her clear, looping handwriting, Sarah had written, "If you're reading this, Thomas, then I did what I always hoped I'd be strong enough to do. I let the boys meet their father. I want you to know I never kept them from you out of spite. I kept them from the pain of being unwanted. But I know now, I was wrong. They need you. You're the man I trusted once, and I still trust you now. Be the one who stays." The judge looked up, her expression unreadable. Thomas's voice cracked. "I want to be the one who stays. For good." Judith's lawyer objected. "A letter doesn't change the years of absence." But the judge raised a hand. "It's not just about time. It's about intent and truth." Then came the moment Thomas hadn't prepared for. "Would the children like to speak?" the judge asked. The room turned toward the boys. Ethan hesitated, then stood, holding Daniel's hand. He looked up at the judge with wide, honest eyes. "We want to stay with him. Mom called him our code, said he wasn't perfect, but he was ours." Daniel added, "He reads to us, he cries when we do, he listens, and he loves Mom even though she's gone." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I'll take this under consideration, but I want to thank the boys for their honesty. It speaks louder than any document." As they exited the courtroom, the boys clung to Thomas's hands, silent but smiling. And, for the first time, Thomas didn't worry about what would happen next. He just knew he'd fight for them, again and again, for as long as it took. The night after Sarah was discharged from the hospital, the sky cracked open. Rain lashed against the windows of Thomas's home, lightning strobing across the high ceilings, followed by long, trembling rolls of thunder. The boys had been unusually quiet all day, a silence Thomas now recognized not as calm, but as fear. They'd spent the afternoon curled up beside their mother in her room, talking in hushed voices, heads bowed together like they were afraid saying something too loudly might shatter the fragile peace they'd found. When it was finally time to tuck them in, Ethan hesitated at the doorway of their shared bedroom, glancing up at Thomas with wide, searching eyes. "Will you stay a little longer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded. "Of course." The three of them climbed into the boys' bed, Ethan on one side, Daniel on the other. The warmth of their small bodies pressed against him brought a sense of grounding Thomas hadn't felt in decades. "I used to hate the sound of thunder," Ethan admitted softly, one arm tucked around his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Why's that?" Thomas asked, brushing a strand of damp hair from the boy's forehead. "Because it meant she might not come back," Daniel whispered. "Whenever Mom went out during storms, we'd count the seconds between the thunder and lightning to know how far away she was. Ethan always counted faster." Ethan gave a faint, embarrassed smile. Thomas's heart twisted. He pulled the blanket tighter around them. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm right here." For a few seconds it seemed like they might fall asleep. The storm outside roared on, relentless. And then Ethan turned slightly, his voice almost too soft to catch. If she doesn't get better," he began. "Will you go too?" Thomas blinked. "What do you mean?" "If Mom dies," Ethan said, the words falling out like broken glass, "will you leave us too?" The question hit Thomas with the force of a train. He sat up slightly, shifting so he could face both boys fully. "Look at me," he said, trying not to let the emotion crack his voice. Two pairs of tired eyes stared up at him. "I didn't know about you before, and I can't change the years I missed, but now I do know, and I'm never walking away, not for anything." Daniel's lip trembled. "Even if we get sad a lot?" "Especially then," Thomas said, leaning down to kiss their foreheads. "I will be here for the tears, for the laughs, for the messy dinners and the early mornings and the bad dreams. I will be the one who stays." Ethan swallowed hard. "Mom said you were the smartest man she ever knew. She said you could fix anything." Thomas exhaled shakily, cupping the boy's face in his hand. I don't know how to fix hearts, buddy, but I promise I'll never stop trying. The boys didn't respond, but they didn't need to. They both shifted closer, curling into him like he was a harbor they hadn't believed in until now, and as the thunder rolled once more, Thomas held his sons tightly, whispering promises into the storm. Down the hall, Sarah lay in her bed, listening. She had heard everything. The next morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the world with a golden hush. Thomas rose early, careful not to wake the boys, and walked down to Sarah's room. She was awake, pale, propped up by pillows. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the tea Thomas brought. "They told me what you said," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Thomas sat beside her. They needed to hear it. She nodded. So did I. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of what was unspoken settling around them. "I'm not afraid to go anymore," Sarah said finally. "Not like I was, because they have you now. They'll know love, Thomas. Stability. That's all I ever wanted." Thomas took her hand. "You're not going anywhere just yet." "I know," she said, "but just in case. Promise me something. Anything. When they ask why I didn't tell you sooner, don't let them think it was because I didn't believe in you. I always did. I was scared." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. "They'll know. I'll make sure they know." Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks, and Thomas gently wiped them away. "We didn't get forever," she whispered, "but maybe they will." Thomas nodded, his voice breaking. "I'll make sure they do." Outside the window, the last drops of rain slid down the glass, washed clean by the rising sun. Inside, Thomas and Sarah sat together, hands intertwined. Two people who had once let fear steal their time, now quietly building the courage to give their sons a lifetime of something better. A promise had been made in the dark, and, with the dawn, it held. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of slow, gentle rhythms that neither Thomas nor the boys had known they needed. Mornings filled with pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Afternoons stacked with puzzles, Lego battles, and Ethan's endless questions about how clouds work. Evenings ended with storybooks and Sarah's quiet laughter echoing from the hallway whenever she heard Thomas do the voices just a little too dramatically. It wasn't perfect. Sarah's health wavered. Some days she could walk down the hallway on her own, others she barely made it from bed to chair, but her eyes never stopped shining when she looked at her boys, or at Thomas. And the boys, they were changing too. Daniel's sharp skepticism softened. He no longer asked if Thomas was leaving. He simply reached for his hand when they crossed the street. Ethan, who used to sleep with one eye open, now snored beside his brother, tangled in superhero sheets that Thomas had picked out himself. But then came the knock. It happened just after breakfast. Thomas had just finished helping Ethan tie his shoes, a task that still took him longer than it should when Ruth, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway. "There's a woman at the gate," she said carefully. "Says she's family." Thomas furrowed his brow. "Who?" "Her name's Melanie Porter, claims to be Sarah's cousin." Thomas's heart sank. Sarah looked up from the couch where she'd been resting, her face going pale. "She's here?" she whispered. "You didn't tell me you had family," Thomas said gently. "Melanie's distant," Sarah replied, her voice taut. "We haven't spoken in years. We weren't close, but I know why she's here." And she was right. Melanie Porter walked into Thomas's home with heels too high for comfort and eyes that flicked over everything like she was sizing it up for sale. Blonde, sharply dressed, and armed with a manila folder that bulged with paperwork. "I'm here to talk about guardianship," she announced, ignoring Sarah's weak protest. When Sarah passes, the boys will need a stable home. Legally, as next of kin, they have a father, Thomas said, rising slowly to his feet. Melanie barely flinched. A man who only entered their lives 3 weeks ago? Forgive me if I'm not convinced of your qualifications. Sarah sat up, her voice frail but firm. Melanie, please, don't do this. I'm trying to protect your boys, Melanie replied smoothly. From media, from exploitation, from instability. They have stability, Thomas said, jaw tight. They have a home. They have me. And what court is going to believe that without a fight? Melanie retorted. Your money can't replace history. I don't need to replace it, Thomas replied calmly. I'm building one now. Melanie's eyes narrowed. I've already filed a petition. You'll be hearing from my attorney. With that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking like a countdown. The moment the door closed, Sarah broke down. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. I should have told you sooner. She always hated me, said I was weak, said you'd leave. And now she sees the boys as leverage. Thomas knelt beside her, his hands wrapped around hers. We're not going to let her win. How? Sarah asked. She'll make you look like a convenience, someone who showed up for the ending, not the beginning. I have more than money, Sarah, Thomas said, his voice low but sure. I have proof. I have this house, our memories, your letter, and most importantly, I have 2 boys who know who tucks them in at night, who comes running when they call. That's what matters. But Sarah knew the law didn't always work on heartbeats. That night, while the boys were asleep, she handed Thomas a sealed envelope. Just in case I'm not here when this ends, she said, give this to the judge. It's my truth, and yours. Thomas took it with reverent hands. You're going to be here. But they both knew hope couldn't always outrun time. The days that followed were tense. Thomas contacted his lawyers, filed motions, ordered DNA tests. He spent hours building a case not from bank records, but from bedtime stories, from morning routines, from the tiny, sacred details that proved he was a father not by biology, but by choice. The boys noticed the shift, too. Are you fighting someone? Ethan asked one evening, watching Thomas scroll through documents. I'm protecting you, Thomas replied honestly. From what? Thomas looked into their wide eyes, so trusting, so vulnerable. From anyone who thinks you don't belong here. Daniel came closer. We do belong here, right? Thomas reached for them both, his voice trembling with emotion. You belong here more than anything else I've ever built. The morning of the hearing came cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over the city like a held breath. Thomas stood in the mirror, straightening his tie, though he barely recognized the man in the reflection. He didn't see the CEO anymore. He saw a father trying to prove he belonged in his own children's lives. In the hallway, Ethan and Daniel sat quietly on the bench near the coat rack. No bouncing or bickering, no superhero sound effects, just silence, their eyes heavy with uncertainty. Sarah sat wrapped in a blanket in the living room, too weak to make the trip but strong enough to offer one last piece of encouragement. You're not just fighting for them today, she said softly. You're fighting for who you've become. Thomas knelt in front of her, taking her hand. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know I wouldn't change a single moment. Meeting you again, the boys, it rewrote everything I thought I knew about love. Sarah blinked back tears and smiled faintly. Then go show them that man. At the courthouse, Melanie Porter stood in a crisp navy suit beside her attorney, smugly confident as she shuffled her documents. Her expression didn't shift when Thomas entered with his lawyer, James Howland, an older man with kind eyes and a calm, steady presence. Judge Ramos, a woman with a reputation for both fairness and ferocity, presided with cool authority. We are here today to determine custody of Daniel and Ethan Wright, she began. Miss Porter, you filed the motion for guardianship. Proceed. Melanie rose confidently. Your Honor, my cousin Sarah is gravely ill and unable to care for her children. Mr. Wright, though biologically related, has no established legal relationship with them. He's a recent addition to their lives, and I believe the boys need long-term stability with someone who has a proven track record of consistency. Thomas sat quietly, his jaw tense. He expected the slander, but hearing it aloud made it all the more infuriating. Thank you, Miss Porter, Judge Ramos said. Mr. Wright, your response? James rose. Your Honor, we present not only the results of the paternity test, confirming Thomas Wright is the boy's biological father, but also a sworn affidavit from their mother. He handed a sealed envelope to the court officer, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Ramos opened the envelope carefully, her expression unreadable as she read Sarah's neat, handwritten words. For a long moment, the room was silent, but for the turning of paper. When she finally looked up, her voice softened. This letter is compelling. Melanie looked rattled for the first time. James continued. Your Honor, this isn't about wealth or timing. It's about a man who stepped into these children's lives without hesitation, who's tucked them in every night, who's learned how to braid hair and sort through meltdowns over jelly flavors, who was there when one of them had a nightmare and needed someone to say, I'm not going anywhere. Melanie scoffed, but the judge raised a hand. Miss Porter, you'll have your turn. James finished quietly. We're not asking the court to take a risk. We're asking the court to recognize what's already become a reality. Then, the unthinkable happened. The side door opened, and Sarah entered, pale, trembling, but standing. Her nurse followed closely behind with a wheelchair, but Sarah walked those final few steps herself. Your Honor, she said breathlessly, may I speak? Judge Ramos nodded, clearly moved. I know my time is limited, Sarah began, her voice trembling but resolute. But I couldn't let today pass without telling you what kind of father Thomas has become. Not because of biology, but because of choice, because of presence. She turned to Melanie. You may think you're protecting them, but you didn't hold Ethan when he had a fever. You didn't calm Daniel when he had a panic attack because he thought I wouldn't wake up. Thomas did that, not for credit, not for show, but because he loves them. She took a shaky breath. I trust him more than I've ever trusted anyone in my life. Silence followed. Even Melanie looked uncertain now. Judge Ramos took a long pause, then folded the letter and laid it down. This court recognizes Thomas Wright as the legal guardian of Daniel and Ethan Wright. Thomas exhaled, knees nearly buckling. Melanie stood frozen, lips pressed in disbelief. Then she turned, gathered her things, and stormed out of the courtroom. The gavel fell. Thomas turned to Sarah, overwhelmed, and she simply nodded through her tears. They're yours now. As they wheeled Sarah out, Thomas followed closely, reaching for her hand. I won't let you down, he whispered. She squeezed his fingers. You already haven't. Thomas didn't speak during the car ride home. The boys were unusually quiet in the back seat, peering out of the windows, unsure if they were allowed to celebrate what had just happened. In their world, stability was something that could vanish overnight, and Sarah, their anchor, was still slipping away. At a red light, Thomas looked at their reflection in the rearview mirror. Daniel sat holding his sketchbook tight against his chest while Ethan absent-mindedly twisted the string on his hoodie, eyes glassy. Thomas cleared his throat softly. Guys, I know today was a lot. Ethan met his eyes in the mirror. Are you mad at us? Thomas's heart cracked. Mad? No, not even close. I'm so proud of you, both of you. I just wish your mom could have been stronger for longer. But she fought so hard to make sure you'd be okay. That's what today was about. Daniel said nothing, but a tear slipped down his cheek. Back at the house, Ruth, Sarah's nurse, had prepared soup and tucked Sarah into the guest room downstairs. Thomas checked on her while the boys washed up. Sarah looked peaceful, but too pale, her breaths shallow, spaced too far apart. She blinked slowly when he approached. "Hey," she whispered. "Still here?" He nodded, kneeling beside the bed. "Where else would I be?" She smiled faintly. "They're safe. That's all I wanted." "They're more than safe," Thomas replied, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "They're home." Sarah studied his face like she was trying to memorize it. "I was so angry at you, Thomas, for years, but I never stopped hoping, even when I told myself not to." He swallowed hard. "I wish I'd listened better, fought harder, not let fear and ego decide our future." "You're here now," she said gently. "That's what matters." Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, Thomas sat by Sarah's side, reading softly from the same book she used to read to the twins. Her breathing had become more labored, her hands colder. He read even after he knew she could no longer hear him, his voice trembling through the words. When Ruth entered quietly around 2 a.m., she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He didn't need her to say it. Sarah was gone. Thomas leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for giving me a family," he whispered, voice thick. "Thank you for teaching me how to love them." The next morning, the sun shone too brightly for a day that felt so heavy. Daniel and Ethan sat on the porch steps, still in their pajamas, staring at nothing. Thomas stepped outside, lowering himself between them. "Mom went to heaven, didn't she?" Ethan asked quietly. Thomas nodded, tears prickling his eyes. "She did. Peacefully." Daniel looked down at his hands. "Does that mean she's not coming back?" Thomas wrapped his arms around both boys. "Not in the way we're used to, but she's not really gone. She's part of us, in the way you laugh, in the way you draw, in every memory, and I promise I'll keep her stories alive." Ethan leaned into him. "Are we still staying here?" Thomas pulled them closer. "Forever, if you'll have me." Daniel finally looked up. "Even if we mess up?" "Especially then." The funeral was small and private, just as Sarah had wanted. A few friends from the hospital, some former colleagues, and Ruth. Thomas spoke, though his voice cracked often. "She was stronger than anyone I've ever known," he said. "She raised these boys with courage, with compassion, with everything she had, even when she had almost nothing left. Sarah didn't just give them life, she gave them a reason to believe in love." Back at the house, the silence was different now. Not just grief, but transition. The next chapter had already begun. Thomas found himself relearning life from scratch. He packed lunchboxes with notes that read, "Remember who you are." He tried to braid Ethan's hair once and ended up with a tangle that had to be cut free. He helped Daniel build a fort in the living room, only to fall asleep inside it with both boys piled on him like sleepy puppies. And every night, he walked past Sarah's old room and whispered, "I'm trying, I promise." 3 weeks later, while cleaning out Sarah's dresser, Thomas found another sealed envelope. This one wasn't addressed to a court or lawyer. It was addressed to him. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it means you stayed. I knew you would. You always had a good heart. You just didn't know where to put it. Now you do. I want you to remember one thing. You are not just their guardian. You're their father. Love them fiercely, clumsily, patiently. And when you doubt yourself, look in their eyes. They'll always bring you back. Sarah." Thomas sat on the floor, tears falling freely. Later that night, he pulled out a pad of paper and started sketching something new, a building. Not for clients, not for profit, but for children. A place to learn, to dream, to build. He would name it after her, the Sarah Wright STEM Academy. The first birthday without Sarah came sooner than Thomas had prepared for. April had barely begun to bloom, but the house buzzed with life. Streamers clung to corners, handmade cards covered the table, and 2 paper crowns waited patiently near the cupcakes Ethan had insisted on decorating, mostly with blue frosting and far too many stars. "Dad, do we have enough balloons?" Daniel asked, holding a handful of deflated latex like he was preparing for war. Thomas chuckled, crouching down beside him. "I think 24 might be enough for 2 people, buddy." Daniel frowned, calculating something with furrowed brows. "Mom always said, go big or go home." Thomas smiled, his chest tightening with the ache of missing her. "Then we better blow up 6 more." Upstairs, Ethan was taping a drawing above the bedroom door. A crude but heart-melting depiction of 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one labeled Dad, a curly-haired one labeled Me, and one with glasses labeled Daniel. Above them, a heart-shaped figure with wings. Mom. When Thomas walked in, he froze. Ethan looked over his shoulder. "Do you think she can see it?" Thomas swallowed. "Yeah, I think she sees all of it." Outside, Ruth helped set up the small gathering in the backyard. It wasn't a party by traditional standards, no loud music or big guest list. Just neighbors, a few kids from school, and teachers from the local community center. And, of course, the unveiling. Thomas stood before a tarp-covered wooden sign, hand in hand with his sons. "Before we show you what's behind this," he began, voice steady but tender, "I want to thank everyone who stood with us this year, through grief, through growth, through the storm and the sunrise. I promised Sarah we would build something lasting, and with your help, we have." He nodded, "Where curiosity builds futures." Applause broke out, but Thomas heard only the wind in the trees and the quiet gasp from Ruth beside him. Inside the newly renovated building, once a neglected public library, the transformation was breathtaking. Rooms filled with 3D printers, solar robotics kits, walls painted with space murals and math jokes, shelves stacked with books about science, coding, and innovation. More importantly, children filled the space, laughing, learning, experimenting. Later that night, after the last cupcake had been eaten and the guests had gone home, Thomas tucked Ethan and Daniel into bed. The boys wore matching shirts that read, "I built my dreams at Mom's school." Ethan rolled over, holding his stuffed daughter close. "Dad, remember when I thought you might leave after Mom died?" Thomas brushed hair back from his son's forehead. "I remember." "You didn't." "No," Thomas said quietly. "I didn't, and I never will." Daniel propped himself up on his elbow. "Did you ever think you'd have a family?" Thomas paused. "I thought I didn't deserve one, that maybe my chance had passed." Ethan blinked sleepily. "But it didn't." "No, son," Thomas whispered, kissing the top of his head. "It didn't." In the quiet of the hallway, Thomas paused outside Sarah's old room, now converted into a reading nook for the boys. On the windowsill sat a small wooden heart, engraved with her handwriting. "You stayed. Thank you." Downstairs, he poured himself a cup of tea, staring out at the moonlit backyard. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying the echo of Sarah's laughter and the squeals of his sons as they chased bubbles earlier that day. His phone buzzed. A message from his old assistant. "The board has formally accepted your resignation. They wish you all the best. Also, they're naming the new AI prototype Right Mind in your honor." He replied simply, "Thank you. I've already found my legacy." A week later, Thomas received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a single sentence handwritten on a folded piece of paper. "The boy, who once had no home, now builds them for others. I'm proud of you, Thomas." It was unsigned, but he didn't need a name to recognize the voice behind it. He held it to his chest, letting the gratitude fill him like sunlight. That evening, the boys begged to sleep on the roof, something Sarah used to do with them when she was strong enough. With blankets, lanterns, and giggles, they sprawled across the flat portion of the roof overlooking the school. Thomas lay between them, watching stars blink into view. Daniel pointed upward. "That one. That's Mom's star." Ethan nodded solemnly. "She watches us from there." Then, softer, Ethan turned toward his father. "Mom said you had a computer heart, that it didn't know how to love. But I don't think that's true anymore." Thomas turned his face away for a moment, overcome. Then he wrapped an arm around each boy, pulling them close. "It just needed the right code," he whispered. "What was it?" Daniel asked, eyes wide with wonder. Thomas looked up at the stars. "Love," he said simply. "Your mom gave it to me." Above them, the sky stretched endlessly, and below it, a man who once thought he'd live and die alone finally knew what it meant to stay.